Continued page 216. The day after next, a few days before the opening of the gates, Dr. Rio was coming home at lunchtime, wondering if he would find the telegram that he was expecting. Although his days were as exhausting as the height of the plague, the expectation of being free at last had dispersed all his own tiredness. Now he had hope, and was pleased that he did. One cannot constantly tighten one's will and brace oneself. It is a joy at last to release this bundle of forces plaited together for the struggle, and to let them flow free. If the expected telegram was also favorable, then Rio could start again. It felt to him as though everyone was starting again. He went past the concierge's lodge. A new concierge, his face pressed a little to the window, smiled at him. As he went up the stairs, Rio saw his own face, pale with exhaustion and privation. Yes, he would start again when the abstraction was over and with a little luck. But he was opening his door at the very moment when his mother came to meet him, saying that Monsieur Theroux was unwell. He had got up that morning, but had been unable to go out, so had returned to his bed. Madame Rio was worried. "Perhaps it's nothing serious," her son said. Theroux was lying flat out, his heavy head making a dent in the bolster, his large chest outlined beneath the thick blankets. He had a temperature and a headache. He told Rio that these were vague symptoms that could easily be those of the plague. "No, nothing definite yet," said Rio after examining him. But Theroux had a raging thirst. In the corridor, the doctor told his mother that this might be the start of the plague. "Oh no," she said, "it can't be, not now." And immediately afterwards, "Let's keep him here, Bernard." Rio thought about it. "I don't have the right," he said, "but the gates are going to reopen. I think that would be the first right I would claim for myself if you were not here." "Bernard," she said, "you keep us both. You know that I have just been revaccinated." The doctor said that the same was true of Theroux, but that perhaps he was tired. He must have forgotten the last injection of serum and forgotten to take some precautions. Rio was already on his way to his consulting room. When he got back to the bedroom, Theroux saw that he was carrying huge ampoules of serum. "So that's it," he said. "No, this is just a precaution." In reply, Theroux merely held out his arm and submitted to the interminable injection that he had himself given to others. "We'll see this evening," said Rio, looking directly at Theroux. "What about isolating me, Rio?" "It's not all certain that you have the plague." Theroux made an effort to smile. "This is the first time that I have seen you injecting a serum without ordering isolation at the same time." Rio turned away. "My mother and I will look after you. You'll be better off here." Theroux said nothing, and the doctor, who was putting away the ampoules, waited for him to speak before turning around. In the end, he went over to the bed. The sick man was looking at him. His face was tired, but his gray eyes were calm. Rio smiled. "Sleep if you can. I'll be back shortly." He got to the door, and he heard Theroux's voice calling him. He turned around, but Theroux seemed to be struggling against putting what he had to say into words. "Rio," he finally managed to get out, "you must tell me everything. I need that." "I promise." The other man twisted his face into a smile. "Thank you. I don't want to die, and I shall fight. But if the struggle is lost, I want to make a good end." Rio bent down and squeezed his shoulder. "No," he said. "To become a saint, you have to live. Fight it." During the day, the cold, which had started sharp, slackened a little and gave way in the afternoon to violent downpours of rain and hail. At dusk, the sky cleared a little, and the cold became more penetrating. Rio went home in the evening. Without taking off his coat, he went to his friend's room. His mother was knitting. Tiro seemed not to have moved, but his lips, whitened by the fever, spoke of the struggle that he was enduring. "Well," said the doctor. Tiro raised his thick shoulders a little out of the bed. "Well," he said, "I'm losing." The doctor leant over him. The lymph nodes were knotted under the burning skin, and his chest seemed to be rumbling with all the noises of an underground forge. Unusually, Tiro was presenting the two sets of symptoms. Rio said as he got up that the serum had not yet time to take full effect. A scourge of fever in his throat drowned the few words that Tiro tried to utter in reply. After dinner, Rio and his mother came to sit with the patient. The night started for him with a struggle, and Rio knew that this fierce combat against the angel of the plague would last until dawn. Tiro's wide chest and broad shoulders were not his best defense. That was the blood that Rio had made flow just now with his needle, and in that blood, something deeper than the soul, which no science could reveal. All he could do was watch his friend struggle. Several months of repeated failures had taught him to judge the effectiveness of remedies he would apply. The tonics he would inject, and the abscesses that he would lance. In reality, his only task was to give an opportunity to that good luck which only too often does not appear unless one provokes it. And luck was what they needed, because Rio was confronting with an aspect of the plague that disconcerted him. Once more it was devising ways of foiling the strategies adopted against it, appearing where it was least expected and disappearing just where it seemed to be already well settled. Once more, it was making an effort to astound. Tiro was struggling, motionless. Not once in the course of the night did he become agitated by the assaults of the disease, fighting only with his solidarity and his silence. But not once either did he speak thus, admitting in his own way that he could not afford to lose concentration. Rio followed the phases of the struggle only in the eyes of his friends, which were by turns open or shut, the eyelids either more tight against the globe of the eye or on the contrary relaxed, so that his gaze was fixed on an object or brought back to the doctor and his mother. Every time the doctor met his look, Tiro smiled with considerable effort. At one time, they heard hurried footsteps in the street. They seemed to be fleeing in front of a distant rumbling that gradually approached and eventually filled the street with its sound of running water. The rain had started again, soon mixed with hail that clattered on the pavements. Great awnings flapped in front of the windows. In the darkness of the room, Rio, momentarily distracted by the rain, looked at Tiro, who was lit by a bedside lamp. His mother was knitting, raising her head from time to time to look closely at the sick man. Now the doctor had done all there was to do. After the rain, the silence thickened in the room, which was only full of the noiseless tumult of an invisible war. Agitated by insomnia, the doctor thought he could hear, beyond the silence, the soft, regular whistle that had accompanied him throughout the epidemic. He nodded to his mother to go to bed. She shook her head, and her eyes lit up. She meticulously examined a dubious stitch at the end of her needles. Rio got up to get the patient some water and went back to his place. Some passers-by, taking advantage of the lull in the storm, were walking quickly along the pavement. Their footsteps grew fainter and faded into the distance. For the first time, the doctor realized that this night, full of late strollers and without ambulance sirens, was like those of former times. It was a night liberated from the plague, and it seemed that the sickness, driven out by cold, light, and crowds, had escaped from the dark depths of the town and taken refuge in this warm room, to make its final assault on the motionless form of Tarot. The pestilence was no longer threshing the sky above the town with its flail, but was whistling softly in the heavy air of the room. This is what Tarot had been hearing for hours. He needed it to stop here, so that here too the plague would admit defeat. Shortly before dawn, Rio leant across to his mother. "You should get some sleep so that you can take over for me at 8 o'clock. Take your drops before going to bed." Madame Rio got up, put aside her knitting, and went over to the bed. For some time now, Tarot's eyes had been closed. The sweat had left the hair in curls on his hard forehead. Madame Rio sighed, and the sick man opened his eyes. He saw the kind face leaning toward him, and beneath the waves of fever, the dogged smile appeared once more. But the eyes closed again immediately. When he was alone, Rio took the chair that his mother had just left. The street was soundless, and the silence was now complete. The cold of morning had started to make itself felt in the room. The doctor dozed off, but the first wagon of dawn aroused him. He shuddered, and, looking at Tarot, realized that there had been a pause and that the sick man was also sleeping. The wood and iron wheels of the horse-drawn wagon could be heard fading into the distance. Outside the window it was still dark. When the doctor went over to the bed, Tarot was looking at him with expressionless eyes, as though still on the side of sleep. "You did sleep, didn't you?" Rio asked. "Yes." "Are you breathing more easily?" "A little. Does that mean something?" Rio paused, then said, "No, Tarot, it doesn't mean anything. You know about the morning remissions as well as I do." Tarot nodded in approval. "Thank you," he said. "Always answer me precisely." Rio had sat down beside the bed. He felt the patient's legs next to him, as long and hard as the limbs of an effigy on a tombstone. Tarot was breathing more heavily. "The fever is going to come back, isn't it, Rio?" he said breathlessly. "Yes, but by midday we should know how things stand." Tarot closed his eyes and seemed to be gathering his strength. There was a look of exhaustion on his face. He was waiting for the fever to rise from where it was already stirring, somewhere deep inside him. He reopened his eyes, and his look was glazed and did not clear until he saw Rio leaning over the bed. "Drink," said the doctor. The other man drank and let his head fall back. "It takes a long time," he said. Rio took his arm, but Tarot, looking the other way, did not react. Suddenly, the fever visibly swept up through his body to his forehead, as though it had broken some inner dike. When Tarot again turned toward the door, Rio's drawn features had a look of encouragement. The smile that Tarot again tried to form could not get beyond his clenched jaws and lips sealed with whitish foam. But in the stiffened face, the eyes still shone with bright courage. At 7 o'clock, Madame Rio came back into the room. The doctor went into his consulting room to ring the hospital and arrange a replacement. He decided also to postpone his consultations and stretched out on the couch, but got up again almost immediately and went back to the bedroom. Tarot's head was turned toward Madame Rio. He was looking at the little figure slumped beside him on a chair, her hands folded on her lap. He was staring at her with such intensity that Madame Rio put a finger to her lips and got up to turn out the bedside lamp. But the daylight was so rapidly increasing behind the curtains that shortly afterwards, when the sick man's face emerged from the darkness, Madame Rio saw that he was still looking at her. She leant toward him and smoothed his pillow, and, getting up, put her hand for a moment on his damp, twisted hair. It was then that she heard in a dull voice, which appeared to be coming from a long way off, thank her, and say that now everything was all right. When she sat down again, Tarot had closed his eyes, and his exhausted face seemed, in spite of the sealed mouth, to be smiling again. At noon, the fever reached its height. A sort of gut cough shook the patient's body as he was spitting blood. The lymph nodes had stopped swelling. They were still there, hard as iron screwed onto the joints. Rio decided it was impossible to lance them. In the intervals between the fever and the coughing, Tarot occasionally looked at his friends. But after a short while, his eyes opened less and less frequently, and the light that would shine from them, from his ravaged features, was paler every time. The storm that was shaking his body with convulsive shudders, lit with increasingly infrequent flashes. Tarot was slowly drifting in the midst of his tempest. Now, Rio had in front of him just a mask from which a smile had faded. This human form, which had been so close to him, was now pierced with spears, burnt up with a superhuman fire, and twisted with all the malevolent winds of the skies. It was sinking before his eyes into the waters of the plague, and he could do nothing to prevent its wreck. He had to stay on the shore, his hands empty and his heart wrenched, with no means, once more, to prevent this disaster. In the end, it was tears of frustration which stopped Rio from seeing Tarot turn quickly toward the wall and expire with a hollow moan, as though, somewhere in him, some essential cord had snapped. The night that followed was not one of struggle but of silence. In this room, Rio, now dressed, cut off from the world and standing over this dead body, felt the surprising calm that so many nights ago he had felt on the rooftops above the plague, after the attack on the gates. Already at that time he had been thinking about the silence that rose from beds where he had left men to die. It was always the same pause, the same solemn interval, the same lull that followed a battle. It was the same silence of defeat. But in the case of the silence that enfolded his friend, it was so compact and harmonized so closely with the silence of the streets and the town liberated from the plague, that Rio really felt that this time it was the definitive defeat, the one that ends wars and makes of peace itself an irremediable suffering. The doctor did not know whether Tarot had in the end found peace, but at this moment at least, he thought he knew that there would no longer be any peace possible for himself, any more than there is an armistice for the mother torn from her son, or for the man who buries his friend. Outside it was the same cold night, with frozen stars in a clear, icy sky. In the half-darkness of the room, one could feel the cold weighing on the window panes, the great, pale breath of a polar night. Near the bed, Madame Rio was sitting in her usual attitude, her right side lit by the bedside lamp. In the center of the room, far from the light, Rio was waiting in his chair. He remembered his wife, but pushed the thought away each time it came. Early in the night, the heels of passers-by had sounded clear in the chill darkness. "Have you taken care of everything?" Madame Rio asked. "Yes, I phoned." When they resumed their silent watch, from time to time Madame Rio looked at her son. When he intercepted one of these looks, he smiled at her. The familiar sounds of the night continued in the street. Although they were not authorized to do so, a lot of cars were driving around again. They quickly sucked at the roadway, disappeared, then later reappeared. There were voices, shouts returning silence, a horse's hoofs, 2 trams screeching on a bend, vague noises, then once more the breathing of the night. "Bernard." "Yes." "You're not tired?" "No." He knew what his mother was thinking, and that she loved him at that moment. But he also knew that it is not much to love a person, or at least that a love is never strong enough to find its own expression. So his mother and he would always love one another in silence, and that she would die in her turn, or he would, without either of them at any time in their lives being able to go further in confessing their affection. In the same way, he had lived beside Thoreau, who had died that afternoon, without them being able to have the time to really experience their true friendship. Thoreau had lost the game, as he said, but what had he, Rio, won? All he had gained was to have known the plague, and to remember it, and to have known friendship, and to remember it, and to have known affection, and to one day have it to remember. All that a man could win in the game of the plague and life was knowledge and memory. Perhaps that's what Thoreau called winning the game. Once again a car passed, and Madame Rio shuffled a little in her chair. Rio smiled at her. She told him that she was not tired, and immediately after, "You must go and rest over there in the mountains." "Of course, Mother." Yes, he would rest over there. Why not? That, too, would be a pretext for memory. But if that is what it's meant to win the game, how hard it must be to live only with what one knows and what one remembers, and deprived of what one hopes. This was no doubt how Thoreau had lived, and he was aware of the sterility of a life without illusions. There is no peace without hope, and Thoreau, who denied men the right to condemn anyone, yet who knew that no one can prevent himself from condemning, and that even victims can be sometimes executioners. Thoreau had lived in a state of turmoil and contradiction, and he had never known hope. This is why he longed for sainthood and sought peace in the service of men? In truth, Rio did not know, and it was hardly important. The only images of Thoreau that he would keep were those of a man who took the wheel of his car in both hands to drive, and those of his thick body now lying motionless. A warmth of life and an image of death. That was knowledge. This, no doubt, is why Rio felt calm when the next morning he received news of the death of his wife. He was in his consulting room. His mother had arrived and almost at a run to bring him the telegram, then went back to give a tip to the messenger boy. When she returned, her son was holding the telegram in his open hand. She looked at him, but he persisted in staring out of the window at a magnificent new day rising over the port. "Bernard," Madame Rio said. The doctor looked absent-mindedly at her. "The telegram?" she asked. "That's right," he acknowledged. "A week ago." Madame Rio turned toward the window. The doctor said nothing. Then he told his mother not to cry, that he had been expecting it, but that it was hard. Yet even as he said this, he knew that there was no surprise in his suffering. For months, for the last 2 days, it was a continuation of the same pain.